interrupt with breaking news from WWL Louisiana.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie Moore. We are interrupting regular programming this afternoon to bring you some breaking news. An indictment handed up at federal court here in New Orleans against Mayor LaToya Cantrell's former bodyguard, Jeffrey Vappie. We now know the charges Vappie will be facing in federal court. Counts 1 through 7 are for wire fraud. Count 8 is for filing and making false statements. Now, WWL investigator Mike Pearlstein is live outside federal court with the latest on this, and I'm here in the studio with David Hammer, another fellow investigative reporter of mine who's been covering this extensively. And we want to hear more now from Mike, who was in court as this indictment was handed up this morning. Mike?
Ended up, we heard Jeffrey Vappie's name being called, but we did not yet know the charges. Now we do. The counts 1 through 7 of wire fraud and the 8th count of false statements. I am here with former federal prosecutor Matt Chester, who can give us some insight into exactly what these charges mean. So the counts 1 through 7 of wire fraud, what is that pertaining to?
So this, we're still reading the indictment, of course, but this appears to be a classic payroll fraud scheme using the wires to further commit that scheme. So the wire fraud counts are essentially the usage of the wires and furtherance of that scheme. Is kind of skimming through. It looks like some of the usages of the wires were some of the direct deposits or some of the payments he was receiving. The government alleges that he was supposed to be on the clock, right? He made representations that he was working on the clock. In reality, according to the indictment allegations, he wasn't, and so then the allegation here is that the wires of those payments to him were based on a fraudulent representation. That's what wire fraud is.
And then we have that 8th count of making false statements. Now, we have seen and we reported extensively on statements he gave internally to Public Integrity Bureau, denying that he was doing anything wrong, working on the clock at these odd hours, but now we see it in the form of a federal charge. So it's my understanding that the statements he gave for the administrative violations would not be part of a false statements. So what does that charge of false statements mean?
So that, anytime you're charged with false statements in federal court, you're essentially, the allegation is that you lied to federal law enforcement. So we're not talking about some statement given some as part of some internal investigation or to PIB. We're almost certainly talking about a statement given to the FBI or some federal law enforcement official, which 18 U.S.C. 1001 criminalizes. So that's almost certainly what we're talking about here.
And one last question here with again, Matt Chester, longtime federal prosecutor. What happens next? We heard that his appearance was not required today. A summons would be issued, but what happens next?
So, next is kind of the typical process every criminal defendant goes through. There will be a notice or a summons issued to him. He will have an initial appearance set for him. He will come in almost certainly with counsel. We understand he may have counsel already. The charges will be read to him in that initial appearance. He'll enter an initial plea. It'll almost certainly be a plea of not guilty. And then he'll be treated like any other defendant in the criminal justice system. The case is going to be assigned to a district court judge. He'll have the opportunity to defend himself in court or at trial if he so chooses. And the case will proceed like any other criminal defendants.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. Appreciate you. And just let me note really quickly that this is part of a much lengthier grand jury investigation that, as we know, and my colleague David Hammer have reported extensively on the activities of Mayor LaToya Cantrell. Jeffrey Vappie obviously was a member of her security team, and the charges related to payroll fraud directly relate to the hours and duties that he spent as a bodyguard for the mayor. Now, this indictment is Vappie alone. There is no hint of what might be coming for the mayor. However, we are on close watch for how this fits into the larger grand jury investigation and what may be coming next for the mayor.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. And we are digging deeper into this indictment and really combing through it. And what it really says on its face is that this payroll fraud scheme was really an attempt to cover up a romantic relationship between Jeffrey Vappie and Mayor LaToya Cantrell. And that is spelled out in great detail in here, talking about how their alleged relationship began November of 2021, that it's been going on since then, which of course, you know, the mayor's late husband was still alive at that time. So this indictment accuses Officer Vappie of trying to cover up a romantic affair, essentially, with Mayor LaToya Cantrell.
And those allegations were made by Jeffrey Vappie's ex-wife in her divorce petition against him as well.
Yes.
But this is now criminalizing that because specifically, it alleges that he lied to FBI agents a year ago about the nature of his relationship with LaToya Cantrell. And we should be very clear here. LaToya Cantrell's name is not in this indictment.
No.
She is referred to as Public Official 1, but it is extremely clear from the definitions of Public Official 1 that it is and could only be LaToya Cantrell, because it is described, Public Official 1 is described as a person who was elected as mayor of New Orleans, then was re-elected to a second term and is still serving as the mayor.
Yes, absolutely. And that really is the making false statements accusation here, is that he met with the FBI in July of 2023, and when he was questioned about whether or not, excuse me, they were in a romantic relationship, he told investigators they were not. Now, using that information, they went back, they got a hold of WhatsApp messages, which are encrypted, disappearing messages that could only be seen between the two of them. They went and looked at that. They went and looked at Mayor LaToya Cantrell and his text messages between each other, and a number of other messaging things are cited in this indictment that say basically they were exchanging messages that you would exchange with someone who you were in a romantic relationship with.
Described as specifically personal romantic text messages. And
yes.
Also, it's important to point out and to focus on the 7 counts of wire fraud, because
yes.
those are detailed in this indictment as well, with specific dollar figures that Jeffrey Vappie was paid for claiming to be on duty when these other documents and records indicate that he was actually spending what was described as personal recreational activities.
Yes. In addition, the indictment mentions the number of trips that Mayor Cantrell took out of New Orleans with Jeffrey Vappie. The indictment says they took at least 14 trips outside the city, and that the taxpayers of New Orleans incurred a cost of at least $47,000 for Officer Vappie's expenses for those trips that he took with Mayor Cantrell. So that is all outlined in this very detailed indictment. It's not something that we see often, but one thing that is of note here is who's prosecuting this. And Jordan Ginsburg is the assistant U.S. attorney who's named on this indictment. We know him from a number of other high-profile indictments of public officials, not the least of which is Walter Reed, former St. Tammany district attorney. He handled that investigation and prosecution. He's handled a number of other high-profile political figures.
Right. That's, you know, public corruption. There's a public corruption, yes. And there's also a white-collar division at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And Jordan Ginsburg is well known for being extremely meticulous, yes. and for developing a lot of documentation to go along with, you know, statements from witnesses and such. So he's not only relying on people's word, he's going to be relying on the transfers of the money into bank accounts. That's what establishes the wire fraud. He's going to be relying on photographs that we already see some of, text messages, WhatsApp messages, yes. other documentation concurrently with these activities to establish that this was actual fraud, that they were defrauding the public out of public money.
Yes, and this really is meticulous. I mean, beyond the numbers, it also goes into how they looked at searches that Jeffrey Vappie made on his computer, including searching the bodyguard's name in the Whitney Houston movie, things like that, that sort of intimated that the two of them were in a personal romantic relationship.
Well, also, he was apparently searching for the mayor of Nashville, who was also facing a similar yes.
Case
where there were questions and charges being brought about the bodyguard's time as well during an alleged romantic relationship there. So he, as soon as he understood, it appears that he was in the crosshairs for this, he started searching on the web for information about others who may have faced similar issues.
But all of that is listed in this this very detailed indictment that we see coming from Jordan Ginsburg and the U.S. Attorney's Office here in New Orleans. So this is a very detailed and voluminous case that it seems that they have against Officer Vappie.
And also there's the appointment to the Hanno board that that Mayor Cantrell gave to Jeffrey Vappie. It was questioned at the time as far as what are his qualifications to serve on this board, and that is also included and mentioned in this indictment. The idea that the mayor was a participant in an artifice to defraud. That's the terminology, essentially, that she was a participant in a scheme. And again, she is not charged with a crime, but she is mentioned without using her name as a part of this whole scheme to defraud the people, the public, out of public money with false statements and false claims of time spent that should have been spent as her bodyguard.
Yes. Now, this indictment also goes so far as to talk about when the mayor was making decisions about who the next police chief was going to be. Talks about how Officer Vappie was a part of meetings when Mayor LaToya Cantrell told former interim superintendent Michelle Woodfork that she would not be getting the permanent job. And it talks about how Vappie then allegedly went with Woodfork to a daiquiri shop to allay her sadness or concerns or feelings about the fact that she was not going to get the permanent job. So I don't know really how that plays into it, other than the fact that, you know, maybe the allegation there is that he shouldn't have been in those meetings.
Yeah, it seems to indicate that he was taking on duties that were beyond the scope of a senior police officer, an appointment that he received long after this alleged relationship began. The alleged relationship began in November 2021. He received he was made a senior police officer in 2023, and that is also part of this indictment, suggesting that there were favors being done on his behalf.
Yes. And, you know, I think, again, as you've been reporting extensively, all of this also comes under the umbrella of this investigation that's been going on and this grand jury that has been going on that we have reported on, looking at Mayor LaToya Cantrell far beyond just the Officer Vappie situation, but her relationships with other businessmen. You know, when I interviewed her last year, I was able to ask her about that. She indicated that she had no ties to anyone that were asking her to do favors for anyone, and that's, again, not mentioned anywhere in this indictment, but we do know that that is kind of happening in the background.
Yeah, you were able to ask her point blank about some of the folks that we were reporting that the FBI was interviewing, businessmen like Fawad Ziton and Randy Farrell, and you asked her point blank about whether she had done anything for them in return for anything that they may have done for her. You know, she specifically said that she did not make any changes in her leadership team as a response to what Randy Farrell asked her to do or anybody else, but we also were able to get audio recordings of her being asked by people associated with Randy Farrell, and an email from Randy Farrell himself saying that he had met with her and had asked her to remove Jennifer Cecil as a deputy director of the Safety and Permits Department while she was investigating Randy Farrell, and she went ahead. The city did fire Jennifer Cecil a few days after that. So that is a separate issue. It is something that we understand that the grand jury has been looking into, and there would be a time constraint here that they would have to bring charges in that issue regarding Randy Farrell and the mayor within the next month or so, because that's when some of these meetings and the decision to fire Jennifer Cecil happened. So again, that's a separate issue from this, but you can see that it all could tie together. It's a similar issue where if you have one person doing something on behalf of the other, if the mayor is doing something to help Jeffrey Vappie get this extra money, it's a similar type of situation. And that's what we saw. Again, I keep going back to Ray Nagin 10 years ago when he was indicted. That was the type of things that they were using to build that case. Some of them were not very high dollar values. There were trips to the NFC Championship game. I reported earlier this week that Mayor Cantrell received tickets to the 2019 NFC Championship game where the Saints played the Rams from Randy Farrell as a part of that potential case. So again, we see that there are small issues that might be worth $1,000, $2,000, but if they add up, those can be the basis for criminal charges.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think that is going to be the big question that we leave walking away from this news today about Jeffrey Vappie is what does this mean for Public Official 1, who, again, is clearly identified in this indictment as the mayor of New Orleans. And so that's what we're going to keep watching and waiting for.
Right, exactly. And Jordan Ginsburg is handling those other cases. Nick Moses is also from the white collar crime division is handling that case as well. We know that. So that grand jury could continue to meet and continue to handle the other aspects of this that we've been reporting on. But today they returned this indictment and clearly said that there's a basis for a criminal case against Jeffrey Vappie, and it directly involves Mayor LaToya Cantrell.
Yeah, let's put that full screen up one more time. Look at the charges again, that we can go over those. We're looking at wire fraud, and when we talk about wire fraud, that means that money was transferred via electronic transfer, and in this case, it's from the New Orleans Police Department to Jeffrey Vappie's bank account. That's why it's wire fraud, and there are 7 counts that are listed and detailed in this indictment about how much he was paid, when he was paid those amounts, and of course, they would have to then prove corresponding information that showed he wasn't actually working when he was getting paid that amount of money. Right. Now, they also charged him with false statements, and of course, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, that involves his interview with the FBI that happened almost a year ago to the day. The FBI interviewed him in July of 2023 and asked him whether or not he was involved in a romantic relationship with the mayor of New Orleans, LaToya Cantrell. He denied having a romantic relationship with her, which would be the basis for that, making false statements charged to investigators.
Right, and each of these wire fraud counts involves multiple payments of over $300 per day, where he is claiming to be working when the federal government, the federal prosecutors are alleging that he was not working. Some of them were going, 12 hours a day or more, where he was claiming to be working and then received over $300 a pop for the pay for each of those days, where the government is claiming that he was not working at all. He was involved in personal recreational activities, as they describe it,
with the mayor of New Orleans. And as David mentioned, the timeline on this which is something that we're going to continue to take a look at, but the timeline on all this is that they allege that her romantic relationship with Vappie began around November of 2021. So that's how long this relationship has allegedly been going on between the two, and that he was then, after that, transferred to her security detail. Is that accurate?
That's what it appears. The timing on that I don't have right in front of me, but it also then leads into the charges that specifically involve being inside the Pontalba apartments when the mayor essentially split from her late husband, Jason Cantrell. We found that she was spending time living essentially inside a city-owned apartment in the Pontalba. That was at issue where the city council got involved, called for her to have to give up that apartment and give up the keys to that apartment. During that time, the indictment says that Vappie was inside the Pontalba apartment with Public Official 1, which we know to be Mayor Cantrell, and claiming to be on duty for 25 days, another period of time where he claimed to be 51 days. So they build up these individual charges, and when you're going at $300 or more per day that he was claiming, then it really adds up in terms of the total dollar amount.
Now, we haven't had time to compare the dates on those photographs that were taken. If we want to just show those one more time, we can see those photographs where we saw Officer Vappie with Mayor Cantrell on a balcony drinking wine, and whether or not those correspond to some of these charges, and if those are used as evidence in this case.
Right, and we know that there was an internal investigation, and as Mike Perlstein said when he was reporting from court, the internal investigation was found to be wanting, that it didn't go far enough to establish whether there were crimes committed, and the federal judge, Susie Morgan, who's overseeing the consent decree that puts essentially the New Orleans Police Department under federal control, found that that was a completely inadequate internal investigation. Obviously, the federal investigators were not constrained in any way, and they were able to do this on their own terms, on their own timeline, develop all of the documentation they needed, develop these internal messages that they were able to get through subpoena power, and that's the basis for a lot of these charges.
Now let's talk about that for a second, because the consent decree for the NOPD is essentially a document that the NOPD willingly entered into back in 2010, 2012
Yeah.
Under Mitch Landrieu, and they willingly entered into it. It is federal oversight to ensure constitutional policing is happening in the city of New Orleans because of a number of high-profile situations where police officers were found to be violating people's civil rights, essentially. And so that gives them the authority to oversee it, to ensure that our police department is operating in a constitutional manner. Now, Mayor Cantrell has made it clear that she feels it's time for us to get out from under that federal consent decree. That's been one thing that she's really been hammering home with the courts. And so when this all unfolded, one of the main problems that the NOPD was found to have is that it was failing to adequately police itself and investigate itself. And so those internal investigations were key to why the NOPD got into the consent decree in the first place. So whenever this came out and it was established that the NOPD didn't go far enough in investigating Officer Vappie, it was an explosive report that came from Judge Susie Morgan, because that, again, is one of the central things that is listed in the consent decree.
Yeah, and we've detailed a number of cases where the Public Integrity Bureau basically cleared police officers who had clearly violated policies, but under the idea that they would not be scrutinized, were able to clear them and raised a whole bunch of additional questions. And in this case, the federal monitors and the federal judge got directly involved and said, no, this is completely inadequate, essentially like it was a sham investigation that helped to cover up improprieties. And so because of that scrutiny now, you end up getting more information than you might otherwise have as federal prosecutors to be able to bring these specific charges.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think this has such a long history, and it's just kind of coming to a head all today. And then, you know, I think, again, as we leave this breaking news situation this afternoon, we're leaving it with a big question mark. What does this mean for Public Official 1, who is clearly Mayor LaToya Cantrell? So what will it mean in the future, and does that mean that we can expect any sort of case against her to come to fruition, any federal charges against her, either related to Vappie or these other things that we have seen federal investigators taking a look at? And
that's what we've seen in previous public corruption cases. They bring in one person, they charge them, they might plead guilty. In this case, we don't expect that because it's an indictment. Sometimes they charge by a bill of information where they already have cooperation from the person who's broken the law or that they allege to have broken the law. In this case, we don't know if but that could still happen. Even though he's indicted, Jeffrey Vappie could still decide to essentially, as they say, turn state's evidence. He could join Team USA and help them build a case. The ultimate person that they would be going for in a case like that would be, you would think, the mayor. So again, he is involved in something where they're saying that it directly involved the mayor. We are already reporting that this same grand jury is looking into potential charges involving other people directly tied to the mayor and whether she received things of value in exchange for official acts to benefit those people. So again, this is the first domino to fall. We saw that with Rodney Williams, if people remember, back in 2013 in the Ray Nagin case. We could continue to see more of these cases develop, and we expect to hear more in the coming weeks. Yeah, so they basically chip away at it, and then they get people to cooperate with them and testify against others. We've seen it with husbands and wives, or people who are in romantic relationships with other people. In this case, you know, this isn't a situation where he could say, I don't have to testify against this person because it's not like they're married in this case. So. Right. Absolutely not. In fact, as the allegations clearly lay out, the romantic relationship happened while she was married to Jason Cantrell and he was still alive. So again, that is not going to deter the federal prosecutors at all. They will be able to get him to testify against her if he agrees. If not, he can stand firm and try to fight these charges, and we'll see what happens. Yeah, I mean, these, again, let's just go back to this indictment and talk about how detailed
the information is in here. It lays out, you know, how often Jeffrey Vappie was taking trips with Mayor Cantrell, which is, of course, something that she's taken a lot of flack for publicly because she's been traveling quite a bit outside the country. We know there were first-class travel issues, that she was flying first class with members of her team, and that she then was forced to pay some of that money back.
Right.
And so this indictment talks about how taxpayers have incurred $47,000 at least for Jeffrey Vappie's travel. So that's something that's listed in here and really spelled out as they talk about this conspiracy, which, you know, at the end of the day is alleging that they came up with this conspiracy to defraud the taxpayers of New Orleans to cover up their relationship.
Well, and the mayor has had to pay back about $28,000 for her first-class upgrades and other things that were not permitted for her travel, but there's been no reimbursement, as far as I understand it, to the city of New Orleans for Jeffrey Vappie's travel, and now we have that detailed here, how much money he cost the citizens of New Orleans for him to go along on these trips, where they're alleging that he was not necessarily serving as her security detail, but as her romantic partner.
Yes. Now, we heard from Mike Pearlstein just a little while ago that, you know, this was essentially the worst kept secret out at federal court. Everyone expected this to happen today, for Officer Vappie to be indicted. He gave us a backgrounder on what we could expect to see happening. So let's take a listen and take a look at that.
Is there any reason why you would attend that board meeting while you're on the clock for NOPD?
Yeah, absolutely. With the permission of the mayor, she wanted me to attend those meetings.
That was then New Orleans police officer Jeffrey Vappie answering questions from an internal investigator about why he was serving as a Housing Authority of New Orleans board member while on the clock for the NOPD. It was among the many instances in which Vappie was reprimanded for irregularities with his hours and duties as a member of Mayor LaToya Cantrell's executive protection team. Now, multiple sources tell WWL Louisiana that a long-standing federal investigation into Cantrell has expanded to include Vappie, and charges against him may come first.
It appears that, you know, whatever they're investigating, it's now kind of gone past the administrative side into the criminal side.
In fact, this email from the outside law firm hired to conduct the most recent internal investigation of Vappie lists 4 potential criminal charges that have been referred to law enforcement authorities, including payroll fraud.
Or at least my interpretation of it is that they've probably been passed on to the Justice Department, FBI, you know, other agencies that outside of PIB.
Did that board meeting have anything to do with executive protection?
No, absolutely not.
So the board meeting was strictly handle issues?
Handle issues, correct.
All right.
Well after Vappie's attendance at Hano board meetings, attorney Justin Schmidt filed a complaint against Vappie after confidential information about his client Ann Bro was included by Mayor Cantrell in a now dismissed petition for a protective order against Bro. Bro, who lives in the city's Upper Pontalba apartments, snapped these pictures from her balcony of the mayor and Vappie at the Tableau restaurant. During interrogations in his internal investigation, Vappie himself said sitting with his back to a restaurant door goes against his executive security training.
The restaurant was very simple. My focus would be on the doors, as you said, and my principle relative to their position to the door.
Federal agents also recently asked about how the mayor obtained confidential information about Bro, including her social security number, old driver's license photo, and an expunged arrest from 2016. Vappie is now the subject of that new line of investigation, along with 3 other officers, Leslie Guzman, Ryan St. Martin, and Sergeant Victor Gant. The outside law firm handling the case, Transcendent Law Group, wrote that it has referred possible charges of computer fraud and public records violations in regard to that breach. But what does all of this say about potential criminal charges against Vappie?
It's been my experience that the more you start to hear, the closer we're getting.
Mike Pearlstein, WWL, Louisiana.
So, of course, we now know that he is not facing payroll fraud charges. He's facing wire fraud charges for receiving the payments from the NOPD to his personal bank account. Something else that we saw there is an interview that Vappie did with Public Integrity Bureau investigators. That's that audio that you have of Vappie. It's my understanding that Vappie also told Public Integrity Bureau investigators that he was not in a romantic relationship with Mayor Cantrell as well. And clearly from the making false statements charge to the FBI, which is spelled out in this indictment, he is facing that making false statements charge for once again telling the FBI that he was not in a romantic relationship with the mayor, while text messages and behavior pictures, all the evidence that we've seen coming out said otherwise.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier, we were talking about the issues involving his role with the interim superintendent, Michelle Woodfork,
yes,
while she was being considered to become the permanent superintendent of the police department. This is a very interesting part of the indictment where it says that to further this scheme, Vappie had disciplinary hearings with the investigators and tried to influence Michelle Woodfork into exonerating him for any wrongdoing for his claiming time on the executive protection detail when he was actually involved with this romantic relationship, allegedly. And that is where he could have been using that time and that access to try to influence her to say, essentially, make it right or you're not going to become the superintendent of police. And she did not become the superintendent of police, as it turns out.
And he was sitting right there whenever she was told that she would not be the superintendent of police.
Exactly. And so that's why this appears to be part of this, that he was engaged in a pressure campaign against Michelle Woodfork to try to get himself exonerated. And certainly the mayor had the ultimate decision-making power there to determine whether she should become the superintendent, which at the time, people may recall, everybody seemed to expect that she would become the next superintendent, not Ann Kirkpatrick, when we got down to the finalists for that position.
Yes, it was between the two of them, and everyone expected that it would be Michelle Woodfork because the mayor had come out and made it such a historic moment and, publicly talked about how excited she was for her to take the position. She was the first black woman to lead the New Orleans Police Department, and that was, something that Mayor Cantrell was very proud of. And a lot of people expected that her continued support of Michelle Woodfork would have made her make her the permanent choice, and instead she went with Ann Kirkpatrick. So it raises a lot of questions, this indictment does, about that process and about how her decision was made.
It also says that he was searching online to find out how secure WhatsApp was when he started to realize that the news media was closing in, and we all started reporting about issues at the Pontalba apartment and the time that the mayor was spending there. And so that's when apparently they allegedly switched to WhatsApp, because it's an encrypted messaging service. But again, it sounds like the prosecutors have been able to access those messages in order to establish that some of them involved romantic messages and photographs that they're going to use to establish that this was all a scheme to try to cover up their romantic relationship.
That's the allegation here. And, it's detailed by both those WhatsApp messages, but there are text messages, photos that were exchanged between the two of them with writings in the photos that appear to come from Officer Vappie to Mayor Cantrell, basically just that were romantic in nature. And so they went through all of their communications and with a fine-tooth comb, it appears, in order to come hand up this indictment and to present this to the federal grand jury, which, as we know, has been meeting over the last several weeks. Months.
Years, actually. I mean, we know that this grand jury has been meeting because they've been issuing grand jury subpoenas related to the mayor. Her image consultant received subpoenas, and other people involved in some of the clothes that she was wearing, yes, and styling that she got. That started in 2022. So we were able to establish that grand jury has been active for much of the last 2 years.
And we know that it's ongoing as well. I mean, as far as your sources are telling you, they're still looking into these relationships that the mayor had, not romantic in nature, but mutually beneficial relationships involving people who either had business with the city or had dealings with the city, who may have been giving the mayor gifts in exchange for favorable treatment, possibly. At least that's the allegation. That is what we've heard that the feds have been looking into over time.
Right. As I reported earlier this week, their sources are telling us that the feds are looking at Randy Farrell, who owns an inspection firm that has millions and millions of dollars worth of business in the city,
yes.
And on behalf of the city to clear construction projects, and that he was able to convince the mayor to fire somebody who was investigating him
yes.
in 2019 and finding that he was involved in improper activities and payments. And when she started making those allegations, she was fired. And earlier this week, we were able to report that our sources are telling us that he paid for that Randy Farrell paid for the mayor to attend the NFC Championship game in January 2019, and a cell phone, a high-end cell phone, and some other things during that 2019 timeframe.
Even fancy lunches and things like that can be used by federal prosecutors, our legal analysts have said in recent days, to file charges against someone for having undue influence and for essentially taking bribes. I mean, that's essentially what it comes down to, and what they may have been looking into. But
yeah, they're going to be looking for high-profile, high-dollar value
yes.
Gifts when they try to establish that, but smaller gifts can be part of the larger charges in a case
yes.
like this, and we saw that again with the last mayor of New Orleans to be charged and convicted of bribery, and that was Ray Nagin, who also received free tickets and, in this case, a plane ride to Chicago in
yep.
2007 for the NFC Championship game, the first time the Saints went to the NFC Championship game, and that was part of the charges against him in federal court, but it was a minor part of it. So again, we'll have to see if this is part of a larger pattern that these prosecutors are trying to establish.
So we want to just recap today's breaking developments at federal court right here in New Orleans. Mayor's former bodyguard, Jeffrey Vappie, was indicted on an 8-count indictment at federal court. He faces 7 counts of wire fraud and 1 count of making false statements. Now, what you're looking at on your screen right there is a photo from the indictment that appears to be some sort of beverage with a journal or a note or something that appears to have been written by either the mayor or Vappie. I haven't had a chance to really read that closely, but it appears to be some sort of writing that goes to establish their personal romantic relationship, and that really is at the heart of this indictment that we saw handed up today, whether or not the mayor and Officer Jeffrey Vappie had a personal relationship, and that this but the indictment indicates that his employment as a member of her security detail, that was part of, an attempt to hide it.
Right, and that image that we just saw was from June 21st, 2022, an image that was sent from Jeffrey Vappie to the mayor, expressing love and other terms of endearment, terms of endearment, and express their love, attraction, and affection for the other.
Okay, well, we're of course going to continue to dig into this indictment throughout the afternoon and bring you the very latest tonight on the WWL Louisiana News at 5. But for now, we want to send it back to regular programming.
This has been breaking news from WWL Louisiana.